I'm Audrey Nicol, MSP, and I'm convener of the Criminal Justice Committee in the Parliament. And I would very much like to welcome you to the Festival of Politics 2025, where you can expect a pretty exciting range of provoking, inspiring and informing debates and discussions taking place over the next 3 days. So I look forward to this discussion this afternoon and hearing everyone's thoughts and views. And it is important that everyone is given an opportunity to contribute, even where there may be differences of opinion, and that we treat each other respectfully at all times. So we're delighted you can join us today to participate in Scotland's drugs problem in partnership with the University of Stirling, and later I will be inviting you to get involved with questions and comments. So I am aware that this event touches on issues that can be emotive for many people, so please do feel free to step out of the room at any point should you need to just take a moment. We do have a quiet space just out at the very back of this room, and our event staff will be happy to direct you there. Now, if you're keen to throw your thoughts and comments out there, you can do so using the hashtag @VisitScottParl, all one word. That's on X, so that's @VisitScottParl. Or you can, on Instagram, use the hashtag @ScottParl. And I should also add that this event is being recorded and will be available on the Scottish Parliament's YouTube channel in the next few weeks. So on to our panel. I am delighted to be joined this afternoon by Kirsten Horsburgh, Professor Katrina Matheson and Patricia Tracy. So first, Kirsten Horsburgh is currently Chief Executive Officer at the Scottish Drugs Forum, leading efforts to reduce drug-related harm in Scotland. And with a background in mental health nursing, she has over a decade of experience in harm reduction, including managing the national naloxone programme and advising on international overdose prevention. Katrina Matheson, welcome, is Professor of Substance Use at the University of Stirling and former chair of the Drug Deaths Task Force. And her current research includes interventions to reduce high-risk polydrug use and digital solutions. And Patricia Tracy is the head of alcohol and other drugs at Turning Point Scotland and has over 25 years of experience across homelessness and alcohol and other drugs. And Patricia is also on the board of directors for the Scottish Drugs Forum, and her expertise includes assertive outreach, initiatives to tackle Scotland's drugs deaths crisis, and residential harm reduction. So I'm really, really delighted that we have such a wealth of experience and insight on our panel this afternoon. So there will be an opportunity for members of the audience to put questions and views to the panel throughout the event. However, I would like to start with a pretty broad opening question. And I'm going to just come to each of our panellists. I'll come to Kirsten, then Katrina, and then Patricia. So the opening question is how difficult this issue that we're talking about today is for us all. So according to Public Health Scotland, between March and May this year, there were 312 suspected drug deaths. Now, we appear to be grappling with a stubbornly complex issue and holding on to our reputation as having the highest drugs death rate in Europe. So I wonder if you can perhaps see a future where this is no longer the case, and if so, what needs to happen, in particular at high level, to achieve this. So I'm going to come to Kirsten first.
Thanks, and thanks very much for coming along to this session today. I appreciate a lot of people in the room will have been directly affected by the subject that we're talking about today as well, whether that's your own substance use, somebody else's substance use, or indeed having lost somebody through substance use. So always conscious of that when we're talking sometimes in numbers and statistics. And this is real human lives that we're talking about. And I think going back to recording, starting to look at drug deaths back in 1996, since that point, over 18,000 people have lost their lives to accidental and preventable drug-related deaths, which is just utterly appalling and unacceptable. So when we look to the future and what we expect for the future, we absolutely have to have hope that that can be turned around. There is no need for anyone to be dying from an accidental and preventable drug death. I think what we do, there are things we do well in Scotland, and there are obviously things that we are not doing well. The things that we are doing well is we have finally reached a point where we have the right policy direction around where we need to be. But the policy intent without action and that implementation gap and the pace at which change is required is the major issue here. So in relation to some other countries, absolutely there are strategies in place in other countries, and I know we'll come on to that later, that we could be implementing here and we're not. All of these things require urgency. We describe the issue in Scotland as a public health emergency, but what we've done so far is far from an emergency response and lacking the pace and the attention that the issue truly needs. So we absolutely have to believe that change is possible. I think we're on the right side of history for that, and that we need to keep pushing with strategies that we know work and not get tangled up in moralistic arguments around what is the right direction to be going in. And I'll stop there for the moment. Thank you, before I get right into it. And,
I think we could take the whole afternoon to answer just one question.
Indeed.
But interesting points that you made about sort of policy and sort of perhaps other models, and we'll come to those later on. Katrina.
Yes, so it has been proven to be a very challenging problem, but actually we kind of knew it would be. It's a problem that's a long time in the making, and because of that, it's also going to take some time to really turn things around. And within that, we have to acknowledge that drug markets and things change all the time and make things more challenging. So we got to a point where actually we were starting to see some hope of things levelling off a bit, and then drug markets change. And these new synthetic opioids that some of you may have heard of, nitazines in particular, and drugs like xylazine, which are new contaminants in our drug market, they come in and create a new challenge for us. So we've got to be adaptive, and we've got to be, responding quickly to be able to address and to anticipate and be aware of these issues. Some things that have gone well as an example, we know about these new drugs coming on the market because we now do have really good surveillance systems, and that's something that has improved. And we didn't have decent surveillance systems, going back even 5 and certainly 10 years ago. So there are improvements, and we're doing good work in terms of trying to improve treatment and harm reduction services, and there's resource going into things like residential rehab. But we also have a population of people who've maybe got quite long-term drug use, who maybe have had previous negative experiences of drug services, and still carry that as a barrier to maybe engaging with services more generally. So that's something that needs to be overcome, and that's not an easy fix. So although we have got medication-assisted treatment standards, we really want, and we're trying to reduce stigma, and I know we will talk about that also later, we aren't quite able to communicate that effectively enough to people to say, actually things are improving, or we hope things are improving. And so there is help and support there for people who are affected.
Thank you. And I think, you spoke there about some of the kind of newer substances that are appearing and that are causing are proving to be a real challenge. And you spoke there about adaptive services that can respond quickly, and I think that's something that I'm quite interested in exploring a little bit more later on. Patricia, if I can come to you the next.
Sure. I think a lot of things was already said there that I'm not going to repeat, that I agree with. But I think we need to think it would be amazing for us to be in that position. But it's not just about our drug services and what we do in drug services. I think we need to think about this as society and look at all the issues that are impacting the amount of trauma that goes on in our society, the amount of poverty. We need to address some of these issues as well so that we prevent people from using drugs in the first place, so that we can then get these great initiatives that we have. We have lots of evidence that we can use. We just need that implementation gap, that making sure that we make sure that everything we know would work gets put in place. And sometimes it's a bit frustrating because we have fantastic policies that don't always get implemented. Maybe because we're trying to do it too quick. Maybe we need to take our time and there isn't time, but we need to make sure we're doing things well before we're moving on to another thing. And don't move on until we've got that thing right. Make sure that we're embedding the things that we know can make a difference.
Okay, thank you. So, I mean, a broad range of kind of points covered there in our sort of opening sort of discussion. And if I can maybe just pick up on the policy, the point around policy and, you know, where the Scottish Government is going in terms of developing policy that is, you know, truly meeting the needs of a hugely complex and diverse population. Now, I know from my sort of role in convening one of the committees here in the Parliament, one of our jobs is to support the government, perhaps shape policy, refine policy. Do you, just bearing, and I'll come back to you, Patricia, just on that point, do you feel that policy is going in the right direction, or are there specific areas where we need to maybe just revisit it? So, for example, you know, we know that there's been a real success story in terms of the development of naloxone. So things like that have been developed. I'm interested in just from your perspective, where we are going in terms of policy, overarching policy.
I think when you look across Europe and beyond, we have some fantastic policies. I think there's a great policy run about looking at decriminalisation and stuff. There's great the National Naloxone Programme. Our drug policy in itself is very inclusive. We have the National Collaborative, so we're looking at human rights-based approaches. These are all great things. They're great policies. As I say, I mean to look beyond a parliamentary term though, and we need to look at making sure that we get the right people on the table to make these things happen. And it's not just about saying we've got this great policy and then moving on. We need to implement these policies. We need to really get behind them and make sure they're making a difference, because we have fantastic policy.
So Katrina, just on that, I mean, that's a really good point to make, because that kind of issue around the length of a parliamentary term, and just as you're perhaps beginning to get some traction on a policy before into a new term and perhaps a new approach. So I'm interested in your thoughts then, Katrina, particularly given that, you know, we're seeing drug-related harm and drug-related deaths sort of rising, and they've risen quite sharply since 2015. So are we just not getting it quite right yet?
No, actually, I think there's a lot of things we are getting right in terms of the intention and the direction of travel. So all these policy decisions, having a more, so because drug deaths are very much at the hard end of drug use, there's a whole spectrum that leads up to that, and there's issues around prevention and young people that we're missing, and I'd like to say a wee bit more about that maybe in a moment. But yes, that kind of harm at the critical end, and the Drug Death Task Force was sort of tasked with how do we How do we deal with that at that more emergency, preventing people dying? And that's where things like naloxone and getting people into treatment are crucial, and we have the evidence to support that. So we're getting that right. We also have excellent services like overdose response teams, which are again part of that strategy to, you know, when people are at that really critical time when they've had an overdose, to get them maybe into treatment, give them support at that point. So we have these services, and so that is quite strong. But I think the bigger picture beyond, and as Trish says, it's beyond the parliamentary term, it's taking a longer term view. And an example of this would be people who are dying now of drug-related deaths have children and families, and their children are potentially a next generation of people with adverse childhood experiences who are then very vulnerable in some cases, often brought up maybe in kinship care, foster care, as well as losing parents. So, you know, what's been done to support this group of people? So it's taking that longer term view. Often maybe we know drug deaths are more prevalent in areas of deprivation. So how can we join up some of these things where we're looking at prevention of you know, people coming through and getting into drug use or getting heavily into drug use, or supporting them. Addressing deprivation and poverty is crucial to that, as well as this bigger package, and that's not done in a...
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think maybe just for the audience's interest, I think in recognition of the way in which this issue cuts across so many different areas, if you like. So whether it's poverty, mental well-being, child well-being, even things like housing, then here in the Parliament what we've done is we have brought 3 committees together. Now, it's not that easy to do, actually, as I discovered, but when at the beginning of this current session that we're on, it seemed to me bizarre that we were trying to sort of look at an issue that just cuts across. There is no one portfolio, there's not one committee that this issue sort of can insert itself into. So we have done quite a bit of work, as you know, in the Parliament to bring the Health Committee, the Criminal Justice Committee and the Social Justice Committees together to do work on tackling drug harm and drugs deaths. And I think that is what we should have done maybe before now, if you like. Kirsten, we mentioned the naloxone programme earlier on that you've been you've led on, done a hugely important piece of work, and that's been a small piece of really successful policy. I just wonder, it might be a good opportunity just to bring that into the discussion about actually how policy can work and what makes it successful.
Sure, yeah, and if there's people here who are not sure what naloxone is the medication that can reverse the effects of an opioid-related overdose. So when somebody's been using opiates, their breathing is reduced until it eventually stops if they're experiencing an overdose. Naloxone can reverse that effect and allow that person to breathe again until they receive further help. And Scotland's got a very progressive national naloxone programme. It was introduced back in 2011 when I was working as a mental health nurse in a drug treatment service. And I remember distributing the first kits of naloxone to clients that were coming to our service, and seeing the immediate impacts of that. People coming back the next week and saying, I've actually used this on my friend. And I'm like, what do you mean you've used it? Because it was the first time that we'd ever been able to physically provide something that said, with actions rather than words, we care about you and we care about whether you live or die. And it was honestly such a moment within services to be able to provide that, where there's quite often a difficult balance to get that therapeutic relationship with people around drug use services. So that was a really good tool to improve relationships as well. So basically that came from a number of recommendations from different groups. At the time there was the National Forum on Drug-Related Deaths, which was sort of advisory committee to government. There was trips to, unfortunately before my time, to Chicago, to the Chicago Recovery Alliance to see what they were doing there. They've got an amazing ethos and programme around naloxone distribution. And that resulted in some pilot projects in Scotland. Trish, you were probably involved in some of the pilots in Lanarkshire and Glasgow and Highland. And then then the decision was made to get rid of these pilots. I think that's another bugbear and frustration, these sort of small-scale pilots in the heat of a public health emergency where people are dying. Let's stop tinkering around the edges, doing pilots, and just do something when it's the right thing to do. So naloxone was a really good example of that. It was just like, right, we're rolling this out across the country. Everybody will be distributing naloxone in every area across Scotland, and also we'll do it via the prison service. So there was a really positive policy decision just to be like, right, let's get on with it. Shame we couldn't replicate that for things like safer consumption facilities, drug checking services, and these are all the things that, that we absolutely should be doing at scale. So now, I don't know how much detail you want me to go into about naloxone, because I could talk about it all day, but we have got really progressive work happening with supplying police, for instance, with naloxone kits. Police officers are quite often first on the scene of an overdose. The ambulance service are distributing it. We have a click and deliver service, so anyone here today who may witness an overdose, and to be quite honest, the chances of witnessing an overdose, even in your daily life, going about your business, walking along Princes Street in Edinburgh, of spotting somebody who's experiencing an overdose are pretty high, sadly. So carrying naloxone could be the difference from life and death. So you can contact, get online, you can go onto the Scottish Families Affected by Alcohol and Drugs website and order a kit through their click and deliver service. But the primary purpose of the naloxone programme is to absolutely get it into the hands of the people who are most likely to witness an overdose, and that is people who use drugs. They are the best first responders. They are the people who are on the scene when overdoses occur, and they want to look after their peers. So that is the primary purpose of the project. And without a doubt, if we did not have such a substantial naloxone programme, our drug deaths in Scotland would ultimately be even higher.
Thanks for that. And I'm going to do a Fiona Bruce on question time, and I'm going to open this up to the audience, actually, and maybe just ask for anybody who has experience of maybe being trained in the use of naloxone, having administered it, or perhaps you're an employer and you have trained your staff in the use of naloxone. Sorry, I've just completely confused our Parliament staff. So maybe I'll take a couple of comments if we can just keep your comments very brief. So I think there was the lady in the little blue and black blouse here, and then anyone else want to just come in with a quick comment? Okay.
Hi, I'm responding really to the first ask rather than the second ask. What I hear from the panellists is a great deal of faith in the policies, a great deal of support for the policies, and a great deal of frustration at the implementation of the policies. So I'm wondering really what gets in the way. And Kirsten, I heard your passion in terms of naloxone, is that right? Actually getting the go-ahead and rolling out. So what was it that made the difference between that happening and maybe the inaction or the lack of larger scale work and a concentration on pilots? What was it that was different, and how might that be replicated across other policy areas that maybe are just stagnant?
Okay, thank you. Do you want to just come back?
Sure,
Thanks.
thanks, great question. And I think it's more than a written policy on a bit of paper, absolutely. I think the difference with naloxone was that there was a substantial resource put behind it. So there was money for areas to be able to distribute it. It was centrally funded by government. And also there was accountability for it as well. So there was a naloxone advisory group. Each local area had a lead appointed. And they were also responsible for submitting data on the number of kits supplied, etc., and that was looked at on a national level. So there was almost a little bit of competition there as well, like who was supplying the most. I was working in the Borders at the time, they were the best. Yeah, so there was a bit of that as well, but it's not good enough to say, well, we've done the policy, so there you go, on you go and deliver it. It absolutely has to come with resource, accountability, leadership, like really strong leadership behind it, but meaningful leadership. So, and that's at all levels. So local leadership, local buy-in from leadership. Even like my experience at the time was I was a team manager in the Borders Addiction Service. So being able to motivate the team to distribute, so even at that very basic level for leadership, so leadership at all levels is crucial for it too. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on, and we've spoken about naloxone as a really, really important response that is accessible and easy to use. I wonder if I can bring Katrina in just to talk about, I know that your current research, as I was saying earlier on, includes or looks at interventions to reduce high-risk polydrug use. And we know that there are some highly toxic substances in circulation at the moment that are causing a huge amount of concern, including in, for example, our prison estate. So I just wonder, just for the audience to sort of understand what that is looking like, and be interested to hear your comments on that.
Yes, so I suppose it goes back to what's the treatment landscape like for people who have polysubstance use, and that's now become the norm. So going back 10, 15 years, there was more use of heroin and maybe with some other drugs like benzodiazepines. Sorry, I keep leaning forward and affecting my mic. But things have changed quite a bit. So people are using multiple substances. There's multiple substances available to people now, and being, kind of pushed to people. So that influences what people take. But that affects treatment. So our treatment systems are set up largely for supporting people who have an opiate dependence. So we have methadone, which you'll have heard about. We also have buprenorphine, an alternative, and in alternative forms now, which is good. And some sort of support system, psychosocial support around that. But we need to adapt. And so the clinical need is to adapt to being able to support people who are taking different substances. So what's quite common is for people to also take benzodiazepines. So, for example, we have a clinical trial about to start where we're actually looking at an intervention where we're also going to prescribe in a very controlled way benzodiazepines with an opiate. But importantly, it's not just about the prescription, it's about also providing a wraparound psychosocial support, which is about the motivations for use. Why are people taking benzodiazepines alongside other drugs? So we have an intervention developed by people with lived experience and people, a range of other psychologists and clinicians who developed this intervention, and now we're testing it in a randomised controlled trial. But a point about that is it's very rare to get trials like that in, not just in Scotland, but in the UK. There's very few clinical trials in this area where we're really getting to grips with providing clinical evidence on best practice. And we don't have the investment in research to provide that evidence. So that's an area I'm trying to develop more and provide better evidence. But it takes time to do this kind of clinical trial work, unfortunately. But everything, does take time, and getting good quality evidence is part of that. If I can just, one more thing, just on the cocaine point. So a lot of people will take cocaine alongside other substances. So they may be in treatment, but might also take cocaine, or just taking cocaine alongside heroin, or if they're on methadone, for example. Now, cocaine doesn't have a pharmacological treatment. It's very much about psychosocial support, and our services need to adapt to be able to provide that type of treatment support service. And that's difficult because psychosocial support takes longer. It's not like writing a prescription, it takes much longer. And the time that our clinicians have is very tight because they have got big caseloads that they're expected to see and really just aren't able to provide the time, although they would like to, that they need to give the right sort of intervention to really support people. So, yeah, that's me. And sorry, my phone's ringing. I'll just stop.
Thanks for that, Katrina. And one of the points that just on that then, in terms of how we respond to the complexities of what's currently circulating in the market, and we spoke earlier about, and you commented on the need for services, local services, to be able to adapt quickly and be really sort of responsive. I don't know, maybe Patricia, you want to just come in on that point. How important is that?
It's very important, and I think it's very important that we work together to do that when it comes out, and we have the radar system, and we can then work as partner agencies together and share information and actually talk to the people that are using substances, getting that information from them and then feeding that into the system. So that's really important. I just wanted to also pick up on the point about treatment. I think we're working with people that are using really complex amounts of drugs and different strengths, different qualities. We don't know often, and the person thinks they're buying one drug and they're actually, what's in it is actually a different drug. So sometimes it's really difficult to do that in the community, especially when you're prescribing. So I think, you know, I'm lucky enough to manage a service that's in Glasgow that's residential harm reduction service, where we can bring people in from their community, away from their drug use for a period of time, and allow the clinicians to see that person and to look at the right drugs, the prescribed drugs that can help, and put that psychosocial support around about an individual as well for a period of time. And this is something I think that we would really like to see replicated across Scotland. I think it's a gap that how can we help people if we can't actually know what drugs there is? If we take them away for that drug use for a period of time, we might be able to support that. And I know that was in the national mission, and unfortunately that's something that we've not seen roll out across the country. And I really think it does make a difference, given the evidence that we've got from the service that we're delivering in Glasgow. Unfortunately, that's just for Glasgow people, and I think it's really needed in other parts of the country as well.
So I think a couple of points I'm taking away from that discussion is the importance of drug analysis or drug testing when we know there are highly toxic substances in circulation, but also the point that you made, Katrina, about the fact that there are currently very few clinical trials and the importance of investing in research. So that's really interesting. Does anybody want to just come in and pick up on that, whether it's about the way in which services can adapt, or perhaps you've got experience working in research, or no? Yes, the gentleman here, just very quickly, if you want to make a quick comment.
Hello, I'll try my best to say it clearly. I'm quite passionate about this subject. It's all great what you're doing, but I'm an observer and I see, I just see stuff. It seems like you are treating the symptoms rather than getting to the root of the problem with education at pre-teen ages. Now, I've observed that people turn to drugs because of lack of connection or purpose or lack of incentive, inclusivity, lack of confidence or finances in social engagement, normal social engagement, and lack of vision and imagination for their own futures. Mm-hmm. It could be because of, like you say, trauma, had witnessed things. Now I won't go into the details. I've lost people, and well, this is why it's a big subject for me. Now, you're saying about the supply, there's changes. But if we stop the demand, then it cuts out the supply, or the need for supply. And it seems like education around, like, empowering young children into educating them about habit and cravings, awareness around the control of cravings and habits. But I see, and from my age, I was buying cigarettes with my dinner money at 12 years old from the tuck shop with a buttered roll and a packet of crisps. Now I've dealt with different things, but the temptations are being sold to us from a very young age. Tobaccos and vapes are there, and they're glorified. Alcohol, caffeine, sugar, we're being consumerist pressures right in front of us all the way through.
Okay, sir. I'm going to stop you there, and you can maybe just come back in if you want during the Q&A that will be following this open question session. But thank you for your comments, and I saw quite a lot of nodding heads to some of the comments that you were making.
Have you considered that?
Yes, thank you for that.
All the finances and, you know.
Thank you for that. I'm going to move on and maybe just picking up on a couple of the points that the gentleman made, and I'd like to ask about stigma, and this is something certainly in the work that that we've been doing in the Parliament comes up time and time and again. I'm interested in your thoughts on what needs to change, what cultural change do we need to see in Scotland to really address the issues around stigma that are still pervasive in all walks of society at the moment. And another big question, so I apologise up front. I'll come to Patricia first.
So your question was about stigma and how we address that, or how, yeah. So that's a massive one, isn't it? You know, I think particularly in this area, I think people think they know about the issue often, and maybe that information is not quite accurate. I think what we see in the media often doesn't help portray the image of that as well. I think we often need to test ourselves that we're not maybe being judgmental as well, because I think there's so much that we hear and that a moralistic sort of point of view. So I think there's public campaigns we need to look at for stigma, but I also think just about being a kinder, fairer society would make a difference. And I think your point there was about also just resonated with me that it's if we were to be more supportive as a culture from birth or before birth, actually, and address issues and help people all the way along in their journey, then maybe that would go some way at reducing stigma, but also maybe reducing the amount of drugs that people take.
Yeah, and I suppose the other thing that we think about when we're discussing stigma is use of language as well. So, Katrina, I'm interested in your thoughts on how we tackle this, or can we tackle it?
Yes. I mean, we can, and we have made some inroads to that. But it's a cultural and population level challenge for us. So when it comes to language, we've now adopted, many of us that work in the kind of field, what we call people first language. So you're talking about a person, that's the most important thing. You're not talking about somebody's behaviour, or so we prefer not to refer to people as addicts, for example, which does happen, but a person with a drug problem or a person who uses substances. So people first language is really important as a way of trying to get back to remembering we're talking about people and individuals. But language goes, you find all sorts of words and language that we used, things that we used to use, and then you think, well, actually, that's not really acceptable now. So we do need to reflect on that quite a bit, I would say. And just, it's tricky because in some some areas of the drug world using language like people calling themselves an addict is actually something they will choose to do, or say, I used to be an addict. But actually, you know, generally, we prefer to just say, I used to be, you know, somebody who used substances or had problem with substance use or particular drug use. So, yeah, it's a way of making inroads into a bigger issue around how we perceive people who have got drug problems.
Kirsten, I suppose one of the things that we think about when we're thinking about or discussing stigma and looking at how we challenge it is social media. But I'm interested in your sort of thoughts.
Yeah, it's no understatement to say that stigma kills. Stigma affects how people view themselves, it affects what services they approach, it affects how they're treated by the services, it affects how people are spoken about. And you know, it's not rocket science to show a bit of kindness to people. And you know, is it acceptable as a society, for instance, that if you attend a pharmacy and you're somebody who uses drugs, that you often have to have a different queue, or you're served second, or you actually have to go to a hatch sometimes on the different side? Is it acceptable that when you go to a GP, you're seen as drug seeking ahead of being seen as somebody who's going in with a general medical problem? These are all still issues that exist, and we might want to deny it. And certainly my background's nursing, and you know, even in drug treatment services, we still have stigmatising attitudes and values within the very services that are there to support people. And we have to call it for what it is. Stigma and discrimination is never going to help us support people going forward. Social media also plays a massive role. I mean, we've, as an organisation, and personally, we've came off the platform, Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, because it is toxic, and it invites some of the most toxic, polarising views that are, you know, are just so detrimental to people. And the area of drugs policy and practice is a polarising area anyway. People have very different views around whether our approach, for instance, should be abstinence-based, and that we should be aiming to help people get off everybody to become abstinent, or whether harm reduction as an approach is a viable one. But the reality is that all of these approaches are important, and it depends on what that person wants at that particular time in their life, and we should be supporting people with their goals, not a goal that any one person or organisation has come up with. We certainly don't want to end up in a situation like they've got in other countries, like the States, for instance, where the administration there has had a huge backlash against harm reduction, and what you see there is funding for programs that are delivering critical harm reduction interventions are now being pulled, they're losing staff. So we have to recognise that we need all things for everyone, and it's not one thing or the other, and social media plays right into that narrative of the othering and the sort of pitching different approaches against each other.
Thank you. And I think that maybe leads us into my final question before we open up questions to yourselves. And in terms of maybe learning how we really tackle stigma, we spoke earlier about looking at other models, whether that's looking at issues around sort of models around drug treatment, imprisonment, tackling stigma. So I'll maybe come back to Katrina just to sort of share your thoughts on how important it is that we consider other models and think about whether or not they would work in the Scottish context.
Yeah, I mean, it's crucial to be horizon scanning and to check out what other countries are doing and where they have success. It doesn't mean you can take something or an approach, whether it's a policy level or an... It doesn't mean you can necessarily take that and bring it to this country and it'll work, because we have a very different system, and we've got different legal system, we have different culture in terms of our NHS and treatment and support services. However, we absolutely have to look to those other areas, other countries, and see what is potentially of benefit. So when people mention, when we look at it on more of a policy level, if we think about legislation, people often mention Portugal and how they've decriminalised drugs some time ago, and that was decriminalising the possession of a small amount of substances. So if somebody just had a small amount for personal use, that didn't necessarily mean they would get a criminal record. It meant that they got referred to a panel and were considered for other support out with the criminal justice system. So that's the kind of thing that we certainly can be looking at, and we have looked at, to be fair. We've already looked at that, and we have a form of de facto decriminalisation that we have adopted, because the Lord Advocate has used the limited powers that she has got to be able to say, you know, it's not necessarily in the public interest to prosecute people if they're found with a small amount of drugs for personal use. And to be clear, that's very different from people who are dealing in large quantities of drugs. So we have learnt, and we need to continue to do that. And another example, more at a service or intervention level, Trish mentioned that there is one service in Glasgow where it's a residential stabilisation service. Well, in Australia, they have exactly that. So people who are really in a very difficult, almost quite chaotic drug use, where they are really at imminent harm, risk of harm and overdose, can go into an inpatient setting. It's quite a clinical setting in the Australian model, and get stabilised medically, but also psychologically. And so that's the kind of thing that we have looked at and thought, well, that would be quite useful. There are variations of that, like the service in Glasgow, and we haven't yet been able to get that to be more widely available in this country. But those things are very much at, one is at a policy level, one is at a kind of service level, but we do need to be aware and looking always at what might work, but not assuming that things are necessarily going to be transferable to this country.
Kirsten, last word for you before we open it up.
I think there's two levels of this for me. One is about what's happening in some local areas in Scotland that is good practice that could absolutely be rolled out. So that's a perfect example of one of the things. The other things would be things like the drug consumption facility in Glasgow and the heroin assisted treatment programme. So we do these small little things in different areas. The rollout is the issue. So, you know, we should be having that in any area that would benefit from these facilities in Scotland, and we don't have that. The other thing is, internationally, it's absolutely right. There's pockets of good practice, again, internationally, so there'll be decriminalisation or different models. So in Canada, they're developing a safe supply model of providing people with the pharmaceutical grade equivalent of the drugs that people were using. So there are lots of different things, but no one country has pooled everything into the one place. So it's like we're all doing these little bits of things everywhere, and nowhere has actually pooled it all together to have like a full country model approach. So whilst some of the things, you're absolutely right, wouldn't be able to be exactly replicated, you know, there are variations that could be applied, the same principles, safer housing models. There's examples of high tolerance housing. I always say that the wrong way around. High tolerance housing, where basically there's an acceptance that people are using within the hostels and homelessness services that people are providing, but it's done in a safe way so that people feel able to approach staff or to get help if something goes wrong. So there are so many things that we could be doing, and also it just goes back, I guess, to the points that were made earlier around that upstream approach of looking at poverty, deprivation, trauma, lack of opportunity, all of the things that need really 15, 20-year strategies rather than being at the mercy of political cycles.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much, panel. So now it's time to open up to the audience. So your chance now to participate in the discussion. So if you would like to ask a question, if you can raise your hand, keep it raised until the microphone is passed to you, and it would be very, very helpful if you can keep your questions or comments as succinct as possible, just to enable as many people to come in with questions as possible. So I'll take 2 people at a time, and I'll firstly take this lady up with the pale coloured top, and then the gentleman about 2 rows back from her.
Hello, first of all, thank you for the points raised during the panel, and also for the people who are here who asked questions. I wanted to maybe touch upon something that was mentioned earlier. You mentioned about looking to different countries to sort of know what to do. Does this also apply, or can you also use it to anticipate perhaps the arrival of newer drugs on the market? And if so, how do you do that?
Okay, any volunteers to start with, or I'll maybe bring someone in. Patricia, would you like to come in on that, or Kirsten? Kirsten.
I'll go first. Yeah. Yeah, it's a great point, thank you. And I think it's highly relevant to what we're seeing in Scotland just now, because when we look at other countries like the States and Canada, people will be very familiar with the fentanyl crisis that occurred in these countries, and was introduced in a very similar way to what we're seeing now in Scotland with the introduction of a group of drugs called nitazines, which again are really potent opioids, much, much stronger than the heroin that people are used to using here. And initially in those other countries, fentanyl was introduced into the drug market in combination with the drugs that people were already using. So it would be in the heroin supply, for instance. It then started to become incorporated into some of the benzos that people were using as well. And now you wouldn't see heroin in those countries, or oxycodone, or whatever else people are using. It would generally be fentanyl would be the main drug. And we are seeing that emerge in Scotland with nitazines. So at the moment we are seeing nitazines appear in the heroin supply. We've also had note of that in some benzodiazepines, and people do not know what they're taking. That's the whole problem, that you can give the message to people, don't mix drugs, but actually some of the pills or powders that people will be using might have 4, 5, 6 different substances in the one thing. So without drug checking and people being able to have that autonomous approach to their drug use with a bit of insight into what they're using, it's very, very difficult and dangerous for people. So there is definitely learning from those countries. Some of the frustrations that I have around the rhetoric around this is, oh, what will we do when, just in case we get fentanyl, or indeed nitazines in terms of which we are. All the things we should already be doing, because we've already got a drug deaths crisis. So if we had all the proper infrastructure and supports, the services that were able to adapt quickly, all the supports that we absolutely know work in other countries and that would be workable here, it wouldn't matter what new drug approached our shores, because we would have that infrastructure to support people. So that's my position. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Okay, the gentleman just 2 rows. Sorry, do you want to come back in?
It is one thing.
Of course.
We have something called RADAR, which is a drug surveillance system. So that's something that again came from the task force, which we were able to put in place a number of kind of ways of surveying what's happening internationally and locally, and tying in seizures and what's been picked up in seizures and Europe and the UK. So we do have a reasonably good surveillance system, actually.
I think we do, but I think we also have a Misuse of Drugs Act that gets in the way of the services that we want to deliver. And it becomes very much about debates, about evidence that we know works in other parts of the world. So our drug laws, they sometimes impact on that, and we really need to look at this holistically and look at, allow us and services to actually use the evidence and make these things happen and roll it out across the country.
And if I can just get my tuppence worth in on that, I mean, certainly the Parliament, the Criminal Justice Committee, for one, has made pretty strong representation along with the government to have the current misuse of drugs legislation either rescinded or updated. So we're optimistic that might happen one day. So the gentleman a couple of rows back, and then I'll take this gentleman at the front.
Hi there. Firstly, thanks to everyone on the panel for a really engaging talk. My name's Graham. I'm currently a PhD student at the University of Sheffield, and I'm studying digital harm reduction solutions for people who are leaving prison. But I've got a really good question on that, but there's something that's more pressing I'd like to ask. It was when the panel was talking about the time frame to manage drug policy effectively through Parliament and it being very difficult with it only being a 5-year term. And thinking about how do we manage to implement drug policy effectively over a longer period, do the panel think that this is a perfect opportunity to get some kind of cross-party agreement where we can see drug policy being implemented effectively, for example, over a 10-year period, and that would be the length of 2 parliaments? It just seems like a very good opportunity to investigate something like that. I just wonder what you guys thought.
Maybe one for me, actually. Thank you for raising that point. I mean, it's difficult. 5 years seems a long time, and a sufficient amount of time for policy to be developed or a bill to be passed, and then legislation enacted from that. But the reality is that it can often be a very short time. I think in this particular space that we're discussing, I believe that there is a common approach that we want to turn the tide of drug harm and drug deaths. Political parties perhaps have different views on how you do that. And you know, that's not unique to this particular issue. That's right across a whole range of areas. So certainly from my perspective, what I've tried to do this session since I came in is, where possible, always try to reach consensus on where you are taking policy or working with the government to develop good policy, but also good legislation. And that can sometimes be difficult, but I think that's what we should always be striving to do. So, and I think it's a very reasonable point that you've raised, so thank you for that. I don't know if any of the rest of the panel want to come in on that.
I think sometimes
there's this false sort of debate between harm reduction and abstinence that we certainly deal with a lot, and I think so do politicians. And, you know, I think we need to move away from that. You know, we need to look at what works for individuals, and lots of different things work at different points in time, rather than getting bogged down in a debate that actually gets in the way of implementing good policies.
Yeah, and I think just on that, I mean, I think a typical example of that perhaps is some people take the view that approaches to tackling drug harm should be punitive or more punitive than other parties want. My party very much supports a public health and harm reduction approach. Now, it is absolutely right that there is a punitive element to any legislation and any policy. That's absolutely right. But I suppose in many ways it's about the balance that we want to see, which allows us to do what we all want to do, and that's reduce drug harm. So thank you for your question. I mean, the gentleman in the T-shirt at the front, I don't know if you still want to ask a question, and then this lady on my right.
Okay, hi there, my name's Charlie Hackett. I'm just interested in, you spoke about drug testing. Would that be a low-cost implementation to bring in throughout Scotland into railway stations, hostels, etc. And my other question is, since it's about politics, what effect has the UK government had on the holding back of drug policy in Scotland?
Okay, thank you. So drug testing, Katrina, do you want to come in on that?
I'll do that and let someone else do the questions. So yeah, drug checking. So this is where actually people have drugs and they want to just check what it is, before they maybe take it. So that is something that can be done locally. It can be done in harm reduction services, could even potentially be done in community pharmacies or, across the country. It is done already at festivals. You get drug checking in some festivals. So the technology is there, the will is there in terms of people providing the service. There are some challenges in that you have to work out what you're going to do with drugs. If somebody says, well, they don't want to then, if it tests positive, what do you do with that substance? But those things can and have been overcome already. So there is proposals in for drug checking in 3 different sites in Scotland, and they've been those proposals have been made. It must be at least 2 years, and there's not. The progress is just glacial, and for all sorts of reasons that we probably don't want to kind of get into. But that's where it's a real frustration, because we know that's something that we could do locally, check what is actually, especially now, because actually since that plan for drug checking went in and those proposals were made, the drugs market has changed, and we've got this new influx of potent synthetic substances. And had we had drug checking locally in place, we could also have picked up and be able to, on a one-to-one local basis with people who we know have got these substances in their, whether it's powders or pills or whatever, you could do some harm reduction and prevent some harm with people there and then. So it's a real frustration that we don't have drug checking.
Patricia or Kirsten, do you want to come in at all, or quite happy?
On that bit or the next bit?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the next bit if you want.
Might as well. Might as well. I absolutely agree. Drug checking would be, such a beneficial thing for people to have. There's really good examples. I really like the work that happens in New Zealand. They've got mobile drug checking. They take it out to services. They can do drop-ins. They have static sites. They go to festivals. They go everywhere. And the knowledge that they get from that, but also that the person that's about to use the drugs gets is life-saving. On the UK government question, I am so glad that we don't have the UK drugs policy in Scotland, because it is draconian compared to the drugs policy we have in Scotland. And whilst, with all the caveats around implementation gap and everything that we have here, the UK government still have a big focus on enforcement, and it's a very punitive approach compared to the policy intent here. And Trish made the excellent point earlier around the Misuse of Drugs Act and how that is prohibitive in terms of a lot of work that we want to take forward here. And it's now it's nonsensical that still exists in that format. I mean, some of the ridiculous examples from it would be, for instance, there's been such a huge increase in the numbers of people using crack cocaine in Scotland, yet because of some wording in the Misuse of Drugs Act, harm reduction services are unable to provide safer inhalation devices for people who are smoking crack. Because of that, it's just so silly. So it's really preventative in terms of tools, equipment, and engagement that we would be able to do with people on a much better level. And obviously there are very different opinions from the UK government compared to Scotland in terms of that compassionate approach to drug use when it comes to things like safer consumption facilities, for instance. There is absolutely no desire at all from the UK government as it stands to introduce those facilities. So it's just so unhelpful.
Thank you. Patricia, do you want to? I think we've covered it. Okay, thank you very much. The lady over here.
couple of questions, but one's for you, Audrey, so I'll give you a heads up. So we know political cycles, we know these are societal challenges that are longer than 5-year term. We know we're going to election, and therefore things will slow down. And we know people are standing down who are conveners of committees. So how does that work from those delivering frontline services, from how do you keep that momentum in Parliament if you're handing over from a convener perspective? And then my other question is, obviously following on some of the stuff said about nitazines coming in, increased use of crack cocaine, I'm just interested, we've heard about prevalence of areas of deprivation, but are you seeing any regional trends or outliers? And is there anything, particularly between like urban versus rural, that you're seeing currently in sort of 2025? I'd be interested to know.
Okay, thank you for the question. And you're right, I am standing down in May and will very much miss this area of work because there's still so much to do. I think we've achieved a bit, but there is a lot to do. What I would say is, and again, this is really just from my own experience, so as an example, so when I came into the convener role of the Criminal Justice Committee, what normally happens is that the previous session committee prepare what they call a legacy report. So it outlines lots and lots of information about the work that was done in the previous session. And you know, the spirit of that obviously is to try to ensure that that work continues and there's a bit of a sort of seamless transition in theory into the next session. And I think that's absolutely the right thing to do. You can't have a system where every 5 years everything just changes and this is dropped and that's forgotten about, and that's not making good law, it's not making good policy, it serves nobody. So as an example, when this session started, one of the things that we picked up in the previous committee's legacy report was, and if you think about 2021, we were coming out of COVID, but COVID had a significant impact on the justice system across prisons, across policing, across the court process, and other emergency services. So we did quite a big piece of work to look at that impact, look at where the previous committee had taken its work, and importantly, look at what the committee needed to do to ensure that the justice system came through COVID and out the other end in a position that was, in some cases, actually working really well, but where there were challenges, and one of those challenges was the backlog of court cases. So where there were challenges, what were we going to do as a committee to support the court system to work through that? Now, in that particular case, there was a little bit of legislative change to allow timescales to adjust. So it's a rather long-winded response, but I hope that we see a similar transition going into the next parliamentary session, and I'll certainly be closely watching. Okay, thank you for those questions. Whether you want to come in, Katrina?
The second part of your question about areas that there might be differences. So for the nitazines specifically, I can tell you from police seizures that the northeast, yeah, is an area where is the highest area in terms of Scotland for nitazines, and only Manchester, UK-wide, has got higher. So you're nodding as if that's not a surprise. So yeah, unfortunately.
Okay, any other questions? The lady to my right and then the gentleman on my left.
The German government recently partially legalized cannabis and arrived in reality. Is this something that the UK government will contemplate as well?
I wonder if we'll maybe just ask you to just repeat that. I didn't quite catch the beginning of it. Sorry, I think the mic was a wee bit.
The previous German government partially legalized cannabis consumption for recreational purposes. Is this something that the UK government will contemplate as well down the line?
I don't know if you want to come in on that. I'm not sure that we know the answer to that question, actually.
Well,
Okay.
we don't.
Kirsten.
But I think, you know, the way things are going with the UK government, I would find it highly unlikely that they would go down a decriminalisation route. Could Scotland do that? I mean, Katrina mentioned earlier about sort of de facto policy that's in place at the minute with recorded police warnings for small amounts of possession for individual use. Question how much that policy's actually come into fruition in practice. But it was a big change. It was quite a big moment there to make such a significant change. So there's perhaps more potential for that in Scotland than there would be in UK, but again it would come down to one, what the Lord Advocate felt was within their gift to be able to change in Scotland, and also any adaptations or removal of the Misuse of Drugs Act going forward. But I would not imagine that that is on their horizon as a priority area in UK government, unfortunately.
And you were specifically interested in decriminalisation as opposed to de-legislating?
No, well, legalizing, partially legalization of cannabis for recreational uses.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't even mention legalisation there because I just feel like that's so far removed from their thinking.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, on the point of legalisation, I think it is definitely that something that should be explored. Like if we're truly being honest about exploring evidence-based harm reduction policies, then that should be on the table for exploration for here too.
Okay, thank you. And the gentleman here.
Hi. So basically, I'm a student paramedic and I've been student paramedic for 2 years. But I've noticed that when we've had someone that's who's taken, you know, drugs, and we've had to admit them, that a lot of what they've taken them because they've had a mental crisis, and then they've taken drugs, and that's been an issue. But then when you take them, you can only really admit them to A&E, and then A&E is just kind of leave them to detox, then we can start the whole process, and that doesn't really, it kind of delays the treatment, and it makes people, I've had patients who, you know, we've said to them, we're going to have to, you know, we'll admit you, but they just kind of walk straight out, you know, 5 minutes, and they go, well, I don't want to stay here because I'm just going to sit for, you know, 8 hours and then detox, and they just go, I'm going home, thank you. And it really makes it a lot harder for ambulance crews to know how should we operate. So I wonder if you guys have any plans on changing that pathway of admitting to hospital services.
Okay, thank you for the question. Katrina, do you want to come in?
Yeah, so there, in some hospitals, and again this is where things vary quite a lot across the country, that there is people based in the hospital, nursing staff who are a drug and alcohol team, who the role is exactly to do that, to link up with people who come in, often through A&E, and have a drug or alcohol problem, and they can then provide that support because that's their specific role, and then try to make links into the community so that when they, you know, they're not just walking out and they're not just going back, and linking in with support systems. Now, for example, we had a really good drug and alcohol service in the hospital in Aberdeen, and the funding was stopped. So, you know, that's the challenge, the ongoing challenge, because, you know, there just funds, decisions had to be made about funds in the NHS Grampian, and that was something that got cut, and that was a crucial service. So that's a type of service that is really important because it takes the burden off the medical staff and nursing staff in A&E, and has a dedicated team who are trauma informed and know all the connections with the community services. So it's happened, it does happen, but it's a fragile sort of state of.
Okay, thanks, Katrina. Kirsten.
Maybe just to add about so yeah, you're absolutely right. You know, say for instance, somebody's had an overdose, the paramedics arrive, person's had treatment, maybe somebody's given them naloxone before the paramedics have arrived, or they get it when the paramedics are there and the person's come round. It's so prevalent that people don't want to go to hospital for a variety of reasons. One, because they don't feel they need it. Two, because they know how they'll likely be treated when they go. And also, like you say, if you know, somebody's going in there, going to have to wait hours. People are, if somebody, for instance, is heroin dependent, then they'll be concerned about being left in withdrawals and the care that they would get from that. So the ambulance service have adopted a variety of different models. Some of that work started through the Drug Deaths Task Force, which was about providing take-home naloxone to people. But also there's a subsequent part to that where there is a near-fatal overdose pathway in a number of areas. And Trish, you probably know more about that, so I'll maybe pass to you just to explain what that is. But essentially connecting people to care in the community so that people can be picked up, particularly when they've had a near-fatal overdose, because what we know is people who die from a drug-related death are likely to have had numerous near-fatal overdoses, and it's that point of intervention or connection for people. But Trish, I don't know if you want to mention how that sort of works in practice.
Yeah, thanks, Kirsten. The information from the ambulance is then shared with the health board, and then the responses for services to response to people, and we try to do that within 24 to 48 hours. And where the evidence that we've found from a lot of the evaluation and stuff we've done, although this is not consistently rolled out across Scotland, is to do that in the evenings and weekends as well, not just during the day, because often that's when we reach people. So that information will come into a team, and we will then prioritise people and go look for them. And you know, that might be a couple of times a day that you go look. You go chat their door at 10 o'clock in the morning, then again at tea time, then in the evening, until we find that person. And you know, and actually, some of the criticism of that was that people wouldn't want you to come to the door, they wouldn't want them to look for. But that's not the response that we've had. People actually thinking, well, you care that much that you came to my door to look for me, or you know where I went. And I think it's really important that we share that information, and that it will support, because that team then can take somebody back to hospital and maybe work with them and advocate for them and stuff as well. So, because I think sometimes people get frustrated trying to explain what's going on for them as well. So often having somebody with them to explain that can help. These teams, I think, we do have it across Scotland, just don't always have it out ours. And that I think it's not just people that have overdosed, Kirsten. I think now we're also looking at people that are at high risk, which I think is really important. People that might have an overdose rather than waiting till somebody's had it. And making sure that we get that support to somebody we know really needs something quickly.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, we've got time for one more question, and then we will have to close the session. Gentleman here.
What are the main factors that make Scotland worse than our European neighbours with drug addiction?
Who'd like to start that one? And so, Kirsten, then Katrina, and then Trish.
Yeah, so it's the question that always gets asked, really. So it's an important one, definitely. And always trying to look at what are the particularities of Scotland that makes us have the highest rates of drug-related deaths in Europe. And, you know, Katrina will be able to talk more around the research around this, but from the way I guess I would frame it is I look at some of our closest neighbours in terms of like England, Wales, who still have high rates of drug-related deaths. A big factor of what we are not doing well is providing treatment to people and meeting that sort of, I'm trying to frame this in a particular way. Let me reframe it. So we are not getting the numbers of people into treatment that would benefit from that treatment, because we know that treatment is a protective factor against overdose. So that is definitely one part of it. Obviously there are reasons going back around poverty, deprivation. You know, you're 15 times more likely to die of a drug-related death in the highest areas of deprivation in Scotland as well. So that the poverty angle and the deprivation angle is is a crucial one. But Katrina, I'm going to pass to you for some of the research behind that, because I think that probably if you started it would have shaped it, my answer.
Yes, I mean, there's a number. So there's no simple answer to that question, which is why we all went, oh, here we go. So I suppose if we go back to 2015, when we really saw a very steep increase in our drug deaths, what happened at that time was a kind of, what I describe it as a bit of a perfect storm in a very bad way, in that our numbers of people in treatment were low for all sorts of reasons around our problems with our treatment services. We had a cut in funding, which came from government, which fed through all of our systems. We had a cut in funding, so services, the wraparound services were no longer there. We also had an influx at that time of what were benzodiazepine drugs, which were novel and new to the system, and people were taking them in large quantities. And that really kind of fueled our increase in drug deaths. And in Scotland, we do like our benzodiazepines, we do like we like our alcohol, or we like our combinations of sedative substances. So, but this is against a backdrop, really, of where we have people who've been using drugs for a long time. There is a group of people talk about an ageing cohort, and then other people say, oh, it's not about an ageing cohort. Well, but there is a group of people who are maybe in their 40s, who started using drugs in their teens, who have had a lifetime of drug use, which takes its toll physically on people's health. It really does. And so you've got the physical vulnerabilities alongside this combination of not being in treatment, not being protected, and then other substances come on, and that is what has kind of fueled our increase. And it kind of let the lid off of a problem that we are now struggling to get back under control.
Thank you.
I think we do have a major problem, and you know we are, you can see, the leaders in that. But I think we recognise we have the problem, so we are looking at recording systems. You know, we've got good recording systems. We face it, you know, and I think that, you know, all these issues that you said were right, but also we want to do something about this. We recognise it. And sometimes that's not always the case, and it's not always recorded in the same ways and stuff. So I think, you know, all these issues are really difficult. All these the different things run about trauma and poverty, but I don't see that being different in some of these countries either. So I think it's about how we're responding, and we need to really stop this false debate and really get alongside people and make sure that we get the right services to individuals, and then we can start seeing that coming down and try and prevent other people from getting into that situation as well.
Thank you very much. So I think we're just moving to the end of the session. Thank you all for your questions. They've been really interesting. But before we close, I'm going to ask each of the panel members maybe just to sum up their thoughts and reflections from the discussion today. I feel you've almost just done that, actually, Patricia. So in that case, I'm going to start at this end and work across. Kirsten.
I think the theme of it for me is the issue is complex, but it's pressing, and we need to move fast if we're going to make a difference. And we know what we need to do, we just need to get on and do it.
Okay, thank you. Katrina.
I suppose you'll maybe, as an audience, you'll think we've talked a lot about harm reduction and almost things that are supporting people taking drugs. What I want to emphasise is some of these solutions are about safe drug use, and also about getting people to a place where they can you know, think and contemplate other things. But the crucial thing I want to get across that we haven't really touched on, so I suppose I'm talking more about the gaps of what we've not discussed much, and it's a gentleman in the audience also raised the point about our young people, and I did say something about this at the start, but we do need to think about prevention, and we do need to focus on young people. We know who's vulnerable, we know what drugs are out there, we know all the challenges, we know the risks, so we need to really think in a joined up way, without too many committees, sorry Audrey, but sometimes committees are not helpful when they talk and don't act, and think about how we intervene with young people to stop the progression into what we now have as people who have entrenched and really challenging problems.
Can I just add, I think we should really need to listen to people that are using drugs and people that are previously using drugs and people that work in services. I think, we have the great policy documents. Let's see how that is actually trickling down. Let's actually assess that rather than moving on to another policy. Let's talk to the people that affects and let us influence that and work together without any false debates. Just get on and get it done. We have evidence. We know what works. Just let us get on and get the help to people that need it when they need it.
Thank you. I completely agree. There's just so much we haven't touched on today. It's impossible to cover everything in real sort of detail in an hour and a half, but hope that today's discussion has given you some things to think about and take away and reflect on. So thank you all very much for coming along today and making your contributions, and particular thanks to our panel, Kirsten Horsburgh, Katrina Matheson and Patricia Tracy for their very insightful contributions, and also our partners at the University of Stirling. And I'd also like to thank our BSL interpreters, Robert Singer and Beth Malcolm. So can I also remind you to complete our survey by using our QR codes, or just ask one of the festival assistants for a paper copy of the feedback form. We really do appreciate your comments and thoughts so that the festival event can be even better next year. Can I also take this opportunity to remind you that there are lots of other festival events taking place until the close of play this Friday. These include an in conversation with Clive Myrie at 5:30 this evening. Then there are panels on the rise of misogyny, Gen Z and politics, and another in conversation event with Maria Alyonkina from the art collective Pussy Riot. So lots of different things for you to join. So I do hope that you're able to join the Festival of Politics either at more of the events this year or again next year. So with that, thank you again to everybody and enjoy the rest of the festival. Thank you.